Well, good afternoon again, folks. Great to be with you. And I'm going to be talking about something that was, in fact, quite close to Bob's own heart. He was very interested in the study of material culture, and he was particularly interested in gravestones and funeral monuments as a way of understanding changes that were occurring as a result of the processes associated with the plantation. He was well known as someone who could be found in many graveyards across the north of Ireland. There's a story told by John Morrell in his introduction to Bob's collected essays that one day Bob and one of his collaborators planned to go out to an old graveyard in Donegal to look for a particular headstone or ledger stone. And unfortunately, they sat in Bob's house drinking tea for quite a long time. So by the time they set off for Donegal, it was getting dark, and by the time they reached the graveyard, it was even darker. Now, the sight of a couple of men going into an old graveyard in the dusk with spades and shovels did excite some local interest. Morrell relates how a crowd gathered that was suspicious, maybe even a little hostile. But the tension was broken when somebody in the crowd shouted out, "Hey, that's Bob Hunter, he taught me!" And the suspicion evaporated, and then it was one of friendly cooperation. Now, what we find in the plantation period, it's not the beginning of stone monuments with inscriptions. There were certainly in the northwest, and my talk is particularly focused on the northwest, there were certainly medieval grave slabs. You can find them in a number of places in graveyards around Donegal. There's a famous one at Clonca graveyard in Inishowen, to a Magnus McCorriston that shows a sword and a cross and a stick with a little ball, a hurling stick, probably a shinty stick, with a ball. So there were certainly inscribed stones from the medieval period, but it is with the plantation that we begin to see many more of these memorials, tombstones with inscriptions, and inscriptions in English and displaying various forms of symbolism. So let me take an example. This is one of the earliest. It's in a location that it's almost impossible to get a good photograph of it, so a friend of mine sketched it out. But you can see, first of all, the inscription runs around the edge of the stone. So the inscription is marginal to the stone. Here is the burial place of John McGee, who deceased the 26th of February 1617, and his family. So marking out the burial place of John McGee and his family. And this was a way in which the incoming settler community were able to put down roots, not simply in establishing their farms and homesteads, but in establishing places of burial that were marked out as being their own. You'll notice as well the coat of arms. Those are, well, I now know those are actually supposed to be leopards' heads. That's the McGee coat of arms. You see the hand clasping a sword, and above that, a Celtic cross. Now, these McGees are very interesting. They came across from Dumfries in the south of Scotland. They were a Catholic family who established a base and were actually very much involved with the Hamiltons. The Hamilton landlords in Strabane Barney included quite a few Catholics among their number. I will come back to that at the end of this presentation. Again, another example of a very early stone. Now, in this case, unfortunately, the surname is illegible. It's just gone. But you can see it's built. It's now on its side. It's built into a low retaining wall at Taboyne Churchyard near St Johnston in Donegal. Again, the inscription runs along here. We've got John, but surname gone. It's from 1626. But it does tell us that John, whoever he was a cloth worker. So his occupation is recorded on the stone. And we do know from plantation records that in this area there were tuck mills, woolen mills. So part of the plantation economy, woolen mills were in operation in this area. And maybe this John, whoever he was employed or worked or ran or managed one of these tuck mills. So it's interesting again that we're not dealing with monuments to the elites in society, the landowning classes. I mean, a cloth worker. We have a tombstone to a cloth worker who died in 1626 in this graveyard in Donegal. A Grange graveyard. We have headstone or a tombstone to a Robert Granger. It's just coincidence that Granger should be buried in Grange graveyard, of all places. And this is one of the stones. Bob, in his essay in Tyrone History and Society, explored some of the very earliest tombstones in County Tyrone. And he pays attention to this one, and even in the slightest details, Bob could bring out so much. So again, we know that Robert Granger was one of the early Scots to settle in this area. He's recorded in the 1622 certificate as part of the plantation survey. We even know the townland he lived in because of the Suminister rolls that have survived and which are part of the database. Again, the coat of arms. So again, signifying a certain status. 3 stags' heads. Again, note inscription around the edge of the stone. 1630. Okay, Robert Granger died in 1630. It begins here lieth, and even the spelling of here, it's H-E-I-R. And Bob notes, well, that's hints of the Lowland Scots. Of course, they were coming in from Lowland Scotland predominantly to this area, predominantly from Renfrewshire and Lanarkshire, this part of County Tyrone. So memorials like this, again, they can help us to connect with the period, but they also reveal something of the character, the outlook, the priorities, you could say, of the families coming in and their importance attached, the importance they attached to places of burial. Now, we also find memorials in churches of varying sophistication. So this is one in Raphoe Cathedral. It's really a large, rough slab on which there is an inscription. You know, it's in uppercase, Roman capitals. It's in Latin. The other ones I showed you were in English, but this is in Latin. Maybe not surprisingly, this is to the wife of a clergyman, Archibald Adair, Dean of Raphoe. And it's to his wife, Ginetta. He gives her maiden name, Houston, and records that although she died at the age of only 20, she had already given birth to twins twice. Only one of each pairing of twins had actually survived. But it says a curious stone. There's nothing particularly sophisticated about it. It's quite crude in a way in terms of its execution. But nonetheless, packed into the inscription, there's so much information about this particular family. And it extols the virtues of Ginetta, the wife of Archibald Adair. Much more sophisticated is the Hansard Monument in Clonlee Parish Church in Lifford, not very far away from Raphoe, in County Donegal. This is a monument to Sir Richard Hansard and his wife, Diamand. Now, you can see 2 figures kneeling, dressed in contemporary costume, kneeling over against the prayer stool, and the inscription behind it. And again, the inscription goes into such detail about Sir Richard Hansard. He died in 1619, October 1619. His wife died just a couple of days later, in 1619. The inscription tells us quite a bit about Hansard. It records how he was born in Lincolnshire. He was a Master of Arts at Cambridge. He was in the Elizabethan army in Ireland. He was granted the fort of Lifford after the 9 Years' War, which ended in 1603. How he was given a patent to develop Lifford as a town in the plantation. How in his will he left money to found a church and a school and to employ a schoolmaster. And it names the executors to his will and how they had fulfilled the conditions in that will. Although it's a monument to Sir Richard very obviously, it's also a monument to the executors and the exactness with which they had carried out the instructions in his will. If you look very closely at it, you'll see where the noses have been sliced off. There's a story that during the Williamite War, Jacobite soldiers came into the church and sliced off the noses of the figures, which were then subsequently replaced. In the mid-19th century, and it was actually painted completely black. But whenever they began to take the paint off, they discovered that the original colours were preserved underneath. Now, in this case, we don't quite know who was responsible for the monument. Amy Harris, who's here today, Dr. Amy Harris has completed a thesis on monuments, church monuments in Ireland, 1560 to 1660. So we can have a word of her about that. But it's likely that it was imported rather than being executed by a local craftsman. I think, don't really know for sure. It's not quite as grand as the Chichester Monument in Carrickfergus. It's not really grand at all compared to that. But it is, as one historian described, a more homely affair in terms of funeral sculpture. Now you can find other monuments. I'm stepping outside Ulster here, but I show this because this is the freestanding monument at Ardbracken to George Montgomery, who in 1605 was appointed Bishop of Derry, Raphoe and Clogher, and who played such a formative role in ensuring that the new church, the new Reformed church, was in such a sound landed base. That was really his main aim, to secure a significant landed endowment for the church. He, after he gave up Derry and Raphoe, he kept Clogher for a while, but he was appointed Bishop of Meath, and his monument is here at Ardbracken in Meath. And it is a remarkable structure for its time. You can see again the effigial figures carved into it. You also find examples of that, again, not very far from here at Bangor, the Bradshaw stone in Bangor Abbey in County Down. And you can see the way the inscription in false relief, again, some of it runs around the edge of the stone. Notice the memento mori, remember you must die, the skull, the crossed bones. And then these three figures. Again, look at the detail there. TB, Thomas Bradshaw, and we think his wife and daughter. So you notice the detail, the ruff around the neck and so on. It's really quite an amazing memorial. It's inside the church now. And then one wonders, was it always inside the church, or had it been brought in from the churchyard at some point? Now, not all monuments survive. Many were destroyed. Many we know were lost in the 1641 uprising. This is all that remains of a memorial to the wife of Sir James Montgomery. She was a Stuart, Catherine Stuart, the daughter of Sir William Stuart, who gave his name to Newton Stuart, and it's in the church in Newton Stuart. But it's all that's left of a much larger and grander monument was destroyed in 1641. Towards the end of the 17th century, he was William Montgomery of Rosemount, the famous author of the Montgomery manuscripts, wrote that it was curious and sumptuous, of divers colours, all polished marble, inscribed with mottos and verses of his, that is her husband's, own composure, and gilded in every fit place. So William had a memory of his mother's monument here at Newton Stuart. Sadly, that's all that remains of it today. Now, you can find in some cases tools associated with the deceased represented on the tombstones. I've mentioned the clothwork, or named some of the clothwork. Well, here we have William Stenners. This again is in Bangor Abbey. William Stenners, here line of body William Stenners, Master Mason. Okay, M.R. Mason, Master Mason. And you can see on it shield, and then the tools of the grave, or not the grave, the mason carved on it. So linking his occupation with representations of the tools he used in the course of his work. And one wonders, for example, was William Stenners the man responsible for restoring Bangor Abbey Church in the early 17th century, or even building the new manor house for Sir James Hamilton at Bangor, which is shown on the Raven maps of 1625-26 that Annalee has referred to already. Let's move back. Now, I've shown skulls and crossbones and so on already. This is a period in which mortality symbols are appearing on many of the headstones. Symbols associated with death. I mean, there was a preoccupation with death. Not surprising in an era where so many people died young, where there's so much infant mortality, that this should be a central preoccupation. Memento mori, remember you must die. And we see different representations of mortality symbols and stones. So this is the Pockridge stone. This is in Enniskillen, inside St McCartan's Cathedral. Again, the inscription runs like this, and then it goes around the stone. The verse on this is actually taken from the statement made by Thomas Cromwell just before his execution in 1540. But we have a representation of the skull. Now, we do see varying depictions of skulls or death's head. You can sort of make an assessment of the anatomical soundness, shall we say, of the skulls. So, in this case, the skull it's got a great big grin on its face and it's staring back at you with these big, wide open eyes. So, we do see a considerable variation in how accurately, in an anatomical sense, the skulls and the bones have been created. We see it here too. This is a desert crate in County Tyrone. Here we have the skull, but it's carved as this one we're looking down directly on it from above. The bones are carved here, but they're quite faint. And in fact, they are interrupted by the inscription. Now, in this case, this is the inscription to one of the most interesting people who lived in early 17th century Ulster. It's to Alexander Sanderson. And the inscription, again, some of it's in Latin, some of it's in English, but it tells us he was a foot soldier in Belgium. He was a cavalry officer in Poland. He then came to Ireland, where he was High Sheriff and Justice of the Peace. So in fact, we know that Alexander Sanderson, Captain Alexander Sanderson, was, like many, many Scots in the early 17th century, someone who went to Europe to fight during the 9 Years' War. We can pick him up in records fighting or involved or stationed in Eastern Europe, in Russia, Scandinavia, in the service of, say, Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden, or whoever it might be. So he's someone who had experience in the east of Europe, returns to Scotland, and then sets his sight towards Ulster. And he acquires a plantation grant in East County Tyrone. So he's not one of the original undertakers in the plantation scheme, but he's part of that wave of newcomers who come in within 10 years of the plantation and establish themselves and set themselves up in Ulster, acquiring lands from others who had given up or sold or surrendered their lands. The symbols of death are not exclusively found on stones to the Scots or even to the English for that matter. This is a very interesting stone. This is from Carndona in North Donegal and Inishowen, north of Inishowen. This is a Doherty stone. It's from 1636. You think maybe 1686, but I think maybe 1636. It's quite faint. You need to get the sun at the right angle. I don't know how much better this is, but we see the skull, the crossed bones, the bell, okay, which was rung at funerals. It's another one of the mortality symbols that we frequently find on headstones. And here we have a representation of an hourglass, time running out. So symbols of death, they transcend, you might say, other divisions within the province. So we're finding them on memorials to the English, to the Scots, and to the Irish as well. An ultimate slide. This is the monument to Bishop William Bedell down at Kilmore in County Cavan. Bedell, of course, very well known, and it's been mentioned already. Brendan has edited a recent book on Bedell. It's a flat ledger stone on a raised sort of vault. It's been broken sadly. You can see a metal pin holding it together here. We have the bishop's mitre at the top. We have the coat of arms, very elaborate mantling around it. And down here again, the skull, the crossbones, the hourglass on its side. Sometimes when an hourglass is shown on its side, it represents life that has been cut short suddenly or abruptly. And we know that Bedell died in 1642, in the year after the uprising, and we know he suffered various privations as a result of that. But look here, the columns here, they're capitals. So classicism is also coming into the fore now, and we see it represented on tombstones. Notice here the open book, very appropriate given Bedell's patronage of the translation of the Old Testament into Irish. Now, the memorial has been restored or repaired at different times. The inscription here has certainly been recut since the original, but still it's a remarkable memorial to a remarkable individual. The final one I want to show you is not a gravestone proper. It's an astonishing stone in some ways. It's actually built into a bridge in the village of Artigarvan in County Tyrone, a couple of miles north of Strabane. Sadly, it's in much worse condition now than when this photograph was taken, and Bob was very interested in this particular stone. But you can see the inscription Adi Gloriam Robertus Algio, 2nd of May 1625, and it displays on it a crucifixion scene. Okay, and you might think, that's a strange stone. Well, first of all, Algio. Who's Algio? Is he Italian? Well, actually, Algio was a Scot. A very influential Scot. Came from Paisley in Scotland. They had been closely associated with the Hamiltons, the Abercorn Hamiltons in Paisley in Scotland, and they turn up in Strabane Barony as part of the plantation scheme there. And they're very much involved in implementing that scheme. Robert Algio was essentially a land steward or agent to the Hamiltons. And like the Hamilton landlords, the Algios were a prominent Catholic family. In fact, it's recorded that Robert Algio opened his home for the celebration of Mass in the late 1620s. So this is a fascinating stone. Its purpose is not quite clear. Was it intended for a new Catholic place of worship? Was it created because of a misguided sense that somehow something like this could be accommodated in the plantation scheme by the late 1620s? It's very strange. How it ended up on the bridge is another mystery. Can't answer that one either. But still, here we have, in the heart of Plantation Ulster, a memorial featuring a crucifixion scene, an emblem associated with the Counter-Reformation, turning up on the memorial to a Scotsman who was responsible for helping to implement the plantation scheme in that area. I mean, if anything captures the complexity of this period, that's it. Thank you.